for David, is that fine?
That's fine. If you don't mind it in shot, I don't mind it.
I mean, actually, no.
Yes, I would just put the chair. Let's just do a little transition between lecture and Q&A. I'll bring the mic, you bring the chair, we'll breather.
So I'm going to leave, they'll maneuver where they need to.
So that's going to be for David?
No, this is for you or Jen.
Shalom, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome. I'm Rabbi Michael Kahana, Senior Rabbi here at Congregation Beth Israel. We are really honored to be hosting this event today, to have partnership with JFCS, and to hear, of course, from our speaker today, which will be really important. Part of what I think is essential for us these days is these connections between different organizations. There is so much that binds us as community, and so many issues that we really need to address and need to understand. It's particularly wonderful when we can have these opportunities to work together. So thank you to JFCS for putting this program together, and look forward to a really wonderful experience. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Rabbi Kahana. My name is Jen Knutson. I'm the communications manager for Jewish Family and Child Service, and I have good news and bad news. What would people like first? Great, thank you. The bad news is that the person who is going to introduce our speaker today is under the weather and unable to join us. That's Renee Holtzman. The good news is that the speaker is still going to be introduced. I also want to say that there are a few firsts occurring right before I introduce our speaker. And one is that thanks to the Women's Giving Circle of the Jewish Federation of Greater Portland, we are able to provide ASL, American Sign Language interpreters, and the people who are watching at home. It is every word that you hear is being live transcripted, and that is in an effort to make this event in particular as inclusive and accessible as possible. So they will be doing their beautiful work in the background. And regarding our speaker, oh, I forgot my phone because I have all of my introduction remarks on it. So in addition to working for JFCS now, I previously had a job with the Harold Schnitzer Family Program in Judaic Studies at Portland State University, of which Natan is the chair. And so I have attended a number of his lectures, and we're so thrilled that he agreed to join us today. And I will add that those of you who are here probably know that JFCS has 4 programs, one of which is Holocaust Survivor Services. And it is from conversations with a number of clients, particularly from the former Soviet Union, that we learned that there needs to be some community education around the experience in particular of Soviet Jews, those from the former Soviet Union. And it is with that that I will more formally introduce Natan, because this is one of his areas of scholarship and expertise. So, Natan M. Meir is the Laurie I. Loquet Professor of Judaic Studies in the Harold Schnitzer Family Program at Portland State University, a scholar of the social, cultural, and religious history of Eastern Europe, of Eastern European Jewry. He is the author of Kiev, Jewish Metropolis, a History from 1859 to 1914, published in 2010. And my phone is so not cooperating with me right now. Don't sign that. And a book published in 2020 called, oh my goodness. Forget it. I know that the title is called Stepchildren of the Shtetl. And after the colon is The Jewish Destitute, Disabled, and Mad of Eastern Europe, as I mentioned, published in 2020. I have read them both. I commend them both to anyone here. I have both copies if anybody would like to borrow them. The only caveat is I need them back. So also, I just want to mention quickly that following Natan's comments, we will have a Q&A. emceed by David Saracen, and I'll provide a brief introduction of him at that time. So everybody enjoy the lecture by Professor Meir, and thank you again for being here.
Thank you so much, Jen. Can everyone hear me okay? It's a pleasure to be here. I can't say you're going to enjoy this lecture, but maybe there's other words for that. I'm really, first of all, I'm pleased once again to be working with Jen, because any opportunity to work closely with Jen is always a pleasure. And I'm also really pleased and gratified that JFCS decided to create a program like this to increase awareness of the history of Jews from the former Soviet Union, and specifically survivors, and the Soviet Holocaust experience. It is one that, in my experience, is much less well known, and people continue to say that to me. In fact, a friend of mine said it to me just now. I don't know very much about when I think of Holocaust survivors, I don't think about Jews in the Soviet Union. So I'm hoping that this talk will help raise some of that awareness. And I have a lot to cover in half an hour, so I'll move somewhat quickly, but hopefully not too quickly. And then if you could save your questions for the end, as Jen indicated, then I'll be happy to take questions then. And also, could everyone make sure that your cell phones are off or muted? That would be helpful in terms of distractions. I should also say that it's really lovely to be back in Beth, Israel, as always. And I'm glad about the partnership that brought about this event. So what I want to do today is take you through an arc from understanding briefly, but hopefully thoroughly, who Soviet Jews were before World War II, or as this war is referred to still today in many countries of the former Soviet Union, the Great Patriotic War. Right? It's not called World War II. It never was in the Soviet Union. It has a totally different valence in the Soviet Union and is still being deployed today by the Russian government for nefarious means, which we can talk about during the Q&A if you'd like, but it's not really relevant to what we're talking about today. So we're going to talk about Soviet Jews before the war. We're going to talk about what happened to them, of course, during the war and under Nazi occupation, and then we're going to move to talk about the post-war decades and understanding how the Soviet Jewish experience after the war was so incredibly different from the experience of Jews and specifically Holocaust survivors in other parts of the world. So if we try to understand who Soviet Jews were in 1939, of course, I could spend the next hour just talking with you about what happened to the Jews in the Soviet Union in the 1920s and the 1930s. For the most part, the vast majority of them are Jews who had lived under the Russian Empire in the Pale of Settlement. So in other words, Soviet Jews are the cousins of American Jews at the same period, right? I'm speaking metaphorically, of course, right? Because they come from the same place. Not all of them, because there are also, of course, Sephardic Jews in the United States and other sub-ethnicities within the Jewish group as a whole. But the majority of American Jews, of course, are Ashkenazic. Many trace their heritage back to Eastern Europe, and so Soviet Jews trace their heritage to pretty much the same place. And there are probably people in the room who have cousins that they discovered at some point in their life living in the Soviet Union. That's a classic story in the United States. So there are just over 3 million Jews in the Soviet Union in 1939. who form about 2% of the total population. That's obviously not a very large percentage of the Soviet population, but they were, as was often true for Jews in the West, overrepresented in many ways, certainly in the western parts of the Soviet Union, which formerly was the Pale of Settlement, and also in cities. You can see here that 87% of Soviet Jews lived in cities in 1939, which means that most Jews no longer lived in shtetls. And there were still some shtetls left in the Soviet Union in the late 1930s, but they were pretty much a shadow of what they had been 20, 30, 40 years earlier. And by this point, most Jews have migrated to the large cities, and many of them now live in cities in the interior of the Soviet Union, like Moscow and Leningrad, because the Pale of Settlement is long gone. The Pale of Settlement was the restriction, legislative restriction, that kept Jews in that part of the Russian Empire, and that was gone by at some point during World War I, and therefore Soviet Jews were free to live wherever they wanted to live. And they also were highly mobile economically, because now Soviet Jews had the freedom to enter into any educational institutions that they wanted. And so many of them did. The younger generation that came of age in the 20s and 30s attended universities, technical institutes, and so on and so forth, and they essentially entered the middle class, the Soviet middle class. You may say, but how, the Soviet middle class? How could there be such a thing, right? This is the country of the proletariat, but there was, in fact, a professional middle class in the Soviet Union. Bureaucrats, party members, engineers, managers, doctors, all of some of them kind of these professional categories equivalent to what we would see in the United States as well. And Soviet Jews did fairly well overall, not all of them, right? Some of them still lived in small towns that were relatively impoverished, but most Jews did well. Many of them assimilated into Russian culture. And so by 1939, the statistic that I have up on here is that 54% of all Soviet Jews were speaking Russian in 1939. So had Russian as their mother tongue. And so that proceeded, of course, even more rapidly in the post-war years, post-World War II. But they definitely embraced the new Soviet culture. Now, I want to also bracket the fact that there was a state-sponsored Jewish culture in the Soviet Union in the 1920s and 30s. And this was called proletariat Yiddish culture. This was an attempt by the Soviet government to keep some sort of Jewish culture alive and thriving that would be attractive to the Jewish masses. Hebrew was, of course, not a part of this because it was considered a relic of bourgeois religion, and it was connected to Zionism, which was anathema in the Soviet Union. So it was only Yiddish, and it was only proletariat in nature. And so there was a thriving Yiddish culture for some years, academic institutes, literature, poetry, and that was essentially all, we'll talk about that a little bit later, it was all destroyed in the years immediately after World War II. And the reality is that the vast majority of Soviet Jews, although they might have found the Yiddish culture interesting, what they were most interested in was economic mobility and a good future for their children, which usually meant teaching them Russian. So if they had a choice between a Yiddish school or a Russian language school, they would usually send them to the Russian language school, right? And who could blame them for that? So the Yiddish culture was important and interesting, but it was kind of a minority phenomenon. I should also mention here that the economic areas that Jews had been most active in the Russian Empire up to World War I, which is trade and commerce, were now illegal in the Soviet Union. And so that's another reason for Jews to move rapidly into the new economic, let's say, professional categories that are open to them at this point. So I also want to say that there's a kind of a socioeconomic divide that we can find in Soviet Jewry, which you probably are already understanding at this point. There is the new urban Jews who are assimilating rapidly into Soviet culture, and then there are Jews who, mainly older Jews, but not only, there are younger Jews as well who have stayed in the smaller towns and who have not left the shtetls for the cities. Those Jews are still there, and those are the Jews who will be murdered en masse in the Holocaust. Also, many of the urban Jews, but as I'll explain in a second, some of those urban professional Jews had the opportunity to flee before the Nazis arrived. I don't know how well you can see this, this chart, but what it tries to show you is the demographic distribution of Jews. So on the left, you can see cities that are indicated by large yellow circles, and those are cities with over 100,000 Jews. So that's Moscow, Kyiv, Odessa. And then there's smaller Jewish population centers, Leningrad, Minsk, Kharkiv. And then on the right, it attempts to show you graphically the Jewish professional breakdown versus the total Soviet population. And one of the most startling statistics here is that almost 50% of the Soviet population is engaged in agriculture, whereas only 6% of the Jewish population is. And when you look all the way on the right, there's the blue bar and the orange bar showing officials, which is basically bureaucrats or managers in Soviet industry, and almost 41% of Jews are in that category, whereas in the larger population it's only 17%. So you get a sense of how Jews are coming into the Soviet middle class. Now, I just want to mention briefly, we don't have a lot of time to talk about this particular element today, but it is important, and we could talk about it at length at another opportunity, which is that in 1939, when World War II begins for the West, the Soviet Union is not at war yet, right? The Great Patriotic War begins in 1941. When Nazi Germany invades the Soviet Union. And what happens in 1939, which is very important for our purposes today, is that as Nazi Germany invades Poland from the west, the Soviet Union invades from the east. And you can see on this map here, the yellow line separating Poland into two, that the Soviet Union then annexes eastern Poland and the Baltics, and then also part of, in the south, you can see Bukovina and Bessarabia. Those are territories contested with Romania. And that means that an additional 2 million Jews are now added to the population of the Soviet Union. So 3 million in 1939, 5 million in 1941, or after 1939, right, once the annexation takes place. So this is a complicated, for historians, this is a complicated situation to talk about because we have the Soviet Jews on the eastern side of that line who have been Soviet since World War I, right, since the creation of the Soviet Union, and then you have the Jews who have been newly Sovietized as of 1939. And that area there between the former Soviet border and the new Nazi-Soviet border in 1941 is a very important area because that's an area that, as the historian Timothy Snyder calls it, is an area of double occupation. First the Soviets occupy, then the Nazis occupy, and that's going to mean terrible things for the Jews who live there. Okay, and so that's a kind of I'm saying that now because it's an important element, but since our topic today is all of the Soviet Union and not just that one area, I'm going to move beyond that to talk about the German invasion of the Soviet Union in June of 1941. And you'll note here that we're skipping over the parts of the Holocaust that we normally talk about at great length. And with good reason, of course, right? So when we talk about, for example, the German invasion of Poland in September of 1939, and the fact that the Germans then begin to set up ghettos in occupied Poland in early 1940, right? Very, very quickly. And so ghettos are created 1940 into 1941. All of that we're not talking about now because we're talking about the specific case of Soviet Jews. So as you probably know about the German invasion of the Soviet Union, although the Soviets tried to be prepared for this invasion, in the end, it caught Stalin on the back foot. And the Germans make very, very, really huge gains within just a few weeks. And this second point here on the slide is very important. I mentioned it a few minutes ago. Stalin ordered immediately that both people and entire factories should be evacuated to the interior of the Soviet Union, mostly to the area of the Urals, the Ural Mountains, which means that these factories were disassembled, put on trains, and they were sent to the east, and then they were put back together again. And all personnel who were deemed essential for the war effort in connection with, especially in connection with the war industry, were also sent east. This is called the evacuation. So when people from the former Soviet Union they tell their family story and they say, we were in evacuation, right? That doesn't make sense in English, but in Russian it makes sense. It means we were evacuated by the government, we were taken to a safe place. So that occurs across Soviet demography. There's no question of Jews being singled out or something like that. Anyone, no matter what your background is, if you fall into that category of evacuation, then you are evacuated. And then those who aren't, who sense that there is danger, must try to flee on their own. And some do that, and some don't. So that's why I've put on this slide, some Jews are able to escape, others are not so lucky, right? Many have no idea what is in store. That's not to say that they did not necessarily know that Nazi Germany was anti-Semitic, because they did know about that, but there would have been no way for them to know about the intent of the Nazis as they were coming into the Soviet Union. And what was the intent? The intent was that this was not an ordinary war. Right? This was not anything similar to the Nazi invasion of Western Europe in 1940. This was an ideological war. And you may know, if you know something about Nazi anti-Semitism, that Hitler envisioned international Jewry, quote unquote, and Bolshevism as two sides of the same coin. They were both dangers, imminent dangers to Germany, and had to be ultimately eliminated. So that means that this was not just a military campaign. This was a campaign against an ideology, against Bolshevism. And since, according to Nazi anti-Semitism, Jews were, and the only way to do this is to use Nazi terminology, right? Because we're quote-unquote carriers of Bolshevism, right, in a biological sense. And so therefore, if one wanted to do battle with Bolshevism, one had to also eliminate the Jewish threat. This was also, again, everything I'm saying here is in scare quotes, right? The Jewish threat, as if there was a Jewish threat from women and children and from most men. And it was usually phrased as, these are potential saboteurs. They are going to be kind of lurking behind the lines in some way, and we're going to have to eliminate this threat before it undermines the German war effort and undermines Germany as a whole. That's why this invasion is accompanied by mass murder almost from the very beginning. So this is what, let me just actually get a show of hands. How many people in this room have heard of the phrase, the Holocaust by bullets? Okay, so a handful, but not that many. This is the phrase that's come into use more and more in the last few decades to describe the Holocaust in the Soviet Union. So this is a Holocaust that is not the Holocaust that most people are familiar with in the United States, which is a Holocaust that we associate with killing centers that kill with gas chambers, right, most notably in Auschwitz. This is a localized Holocaust that takes place in each city and town where the victims are murdered a few hundred yards away from their homes. And often with the collaboration, with the assistance of their neighbors. So that's very different from being transported by freight car hundreds of miles from your home to a basically factory line murder center. And so this is the experience of the Holocaust in the Soviet Union. As I put on this slide, I said already, all Jews are seen as potential partisans and saboteurs and therefore targeted for elimination. The German term for the mobile killing units that were put into place by the Nazis is the Einsatzgruppen, and they were exactly as it sounds. They were mobile killing units that moved quickly behind the advancing German lines, behind the military lines, and they murdered the Jewish population, rounding up the local Jews, again, often with the help of local collaborators, and the victims are taken to the local cemetery or to a ravine, and they're machine-gunned into mass graves there. And the death toll is, and the numbers here are very, very, very rough, of course, because we don't have accurate numbers for most of these murders. 500,000 murdered within 5 months, over 1 million by the end of 1942. The total Soviet Jewish death toll is essentially unknown. Numbers vary from 1.1 million to 1.5 million, all the way up to 2 million. We just don't really know because of the decentralized nature of the murder. I have here a couple of images that relate to the largest killing site, or the most massive execution in one particular, at one time, which is Babi Yar, or Babin Yar in Ukrainian. More and more people are referring to it in the Ukrainian terminology. On the left is the sign that was posted for Jews to assemble at a particular place at the outskirts of Kyiv in 1941. And then on the right, there's an image of soldiers from one of the Einsatzgruppen who are kind of rummaging through the possessions of the over 30,000 Jews who were massacred at Babin Yar over the course of 3 days. And I will also say that Babin Yar continued to be an execution site during the occupation of Kyiv. And not only Jews were murdered there, but also Roma and Sinti people were murdered there, as well as Soviet prisoners of war. This is a map, I don't know how well you can see this, but it's a map of selected killing sites in the former Soviet Union. If it was going to be complete, the map would essentially be black with dots, right? Because there's so many different killing sites across the former Soviet Union. This is a quote from the famous Soviet Jewish journalist, writer Vasily Grossman, who accompanied the Soviet army in 1943 as it took back these territories. And he wrote a piece called Ukraine Without Jews. This is just a very, very short excerpt. There are no Jews in Ukraine, nowhere. Poltava, Kharkov, Kremenchuk, Borispol, Yagotin, in none of the cities, hundreds of shtetls, or thousands of villages will you see the black, tear-filled eyes of little girls. You will not hear the pained voice of an old woman. You will not see the dark face of a hungry baby. All is silence. Everything is still. A whole people has been brutally murdered. Now, the reality is that although the death toll is very, very high, the Nazis did not kill everyone at one fell swoop. In the larger population centers, they created ghettos, as they had done in Poland, and also in some cases labor camps, especially towards the end of 1941, when they realized that they were not going to be able to accomplish the entire occupation of the Soviet Union in one fell swoop, and they were going to be kind of sitting there for some time, and so they decided to create labor camps to support the war effort towards the rear and this is where we're talking about here, these territories of the occupied Soviet Union. And as was the case in occupied Poland, the conditions are very, very brutal in these ghettos. There's all kinds of random terror that happens on a daily basis, and also periodic mass shootings. It's also important to note that although machine gun was the most important method of murder in this aspect of the Holocaust, the Nazis did sometimes use mobile gas vans as well in some cases. But mostly it was shootings. And there was a Jewish resistance movement, as I'm sure you've heard about, in many of the ghettos, especially the Minsk ghetto. There was an active resistance movement underground, and there were Jewish partisans in the forests as well. And that's an important element of the Soviet Jewish experience, the Soviet Holocaust experience as well, because the territory was such in this part of Europe that it was more friendly to partisans who are kind of fighting in the forests. In many parts of Poland, for example, the terrain is much, much more open, it's more agricultural, it's very hard to maintain a kind of hidden band of fighters the way it was in the forests of modern-day Belarus, for example. Okay, so I want to move on now from the war period itself to the post-war period, which was tremendously difficult for everyone in the Soviet Union, right? The Soviet Union experienced tremendous civilian losses, destruction of cities and towns, and so that's one of the reasons why Soviet Jews who are trying to talk about their own particular experience, their particular tragedy after the war, are in many cases dismissed. Because people say, well, everyone suffered during the war, right? And that's what the government eventually starts saying as well. So their particular tragedy during the war is essentially dismissed. And in the post-war years, they're returning to the towns where they had lived before, or the cities they had left before evacuation, depending on where they were during the war years, and they find most people have been murdered. Now, unlike Jews in further west in Europe who, for example, in Poland, who came back to their hometowns, discovered that there was nothing left for them, and then moved on, and many of them eventually ended up in DP camps, and then were able to emigrate to the United States or to Palestine. That was obviously not the case for Soviet Jews. They're not able to emigrate. They can't leave the country. So they have to deal with the situation the way it is, and the situation is a worsening one in the late 1940s and the 1950s, meaning that anti-Semitism is on the rise. The war, for complicated reasons, has unleashed popular anti-Semitism in a way that the Soviet authorities had not permitted in the 1920s and the 1930s. So ordinary Jews are feeling that, right? The anti-Semitism that had been present in Eastern Europe for centuries has not gone away. It was repressed for a while by the Soviet authorities in the 20s and 30s, and now it's come back. There are rumors also that Jews did not fully participate in the war effort, which is an old rumor about Jews and the military in various parts of Europe. That's really nothing new, but it affects Jews all the same, even though, of course, they did participate equally in the war effort in the Soviet Union. And there's also various waves of official anti-Semitism, meaning on the part of the state, which, because of a lack of time, I'm not going to go into in detail right now. But some of them are listed here or actually, I tried to list all of them on the slide. There's a campaign against so-called a campaign against cosmopolitans. That was a euphemism for Jews in 1948 to 1949. All the people who were unmasked in the Soviet newspapers as cosmopolitans, meaning traitors to the Soviet cause. They all have Jewish names, so it's very clear to everyone who these people are. The Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, which was a very important Jewish organization with a very high profile during the war that the Soviet government had created, in part to help raise funds for the Soviet war effort, is now liquidated after the war, and its head, this man who you can see here by the name of Solomon Michoels, who was a very important actor and theater director before the war, he was assassinated in 1948. It was made to look like a car accident. And then in 1952, some of the greatest Yiddish poets of the Soviet Union are murdered in one fell swoop by the Soviet government. That's called the Night of the Murdered Poets in 1952. So not only has the Holocaust left its mark, of course, on Soviet Jewry, but then in the wake of the Holocaust, there's this very clear attempt by the Soviet government to suppress official or organized Jewish culture. And it also becomes very, very difficult to memorialize the Holocaust for Soviet Jews. So ordinary initiatives that we might think of as nothing dangerous as far as the government is concerned, a few people gathering to set up a makeshift memorial for relatives killed in the Holocaust, those were not permitted. And attempts to put together a book, this started during the war actually, it was called the Black Book, an attempt by very prominent Soviet Jewish journalists and writers to collect eyewitness testimony during the war and then publish them immediately after the war was over, called the Black Book, Черная книга. You can see an early draft of it here on the upper right, and that was not permitted either. The book was never permitted to be published in its entirety in the former Soviet Union. And it is available now, parts of it online, and you can actually buy the Black Book. It's available in many translations, many languages, including English. And it's really, I wanted to present some of the documents, and I just didn't have time today, but it's worth looking at because these are, as I said, eyewitness testimonies from survivors in the former Soviet, in the Soviet Union. Right, in mostly Ukraine and Belarus, but also other areas as well. And so the official Soviet policy, as you can see here in the third bullet point, is to minimize the specifically Jewish tragedy of the war, both because of anti-Semitism, state anti-Semitism, and also because generally the Soviet policy is to not talk about ethnic groups as much as possible, or differences between ethnic groups in the former Soviet Union. So there was no Jewish tragedy, and any memorials to those killed during the war, the usual catchphrase on the monument itself is peaceful Soviet citizens, right? Jewishness, their Jewish identity is completely erased. And that's what you see on the original Soviet memorial at Babin Yar, which you can see here. That was erected in 1976. Since then, since Ukrainian independence, there have been a lot more Holocaust memorials put up at that site, and they are very specifically, at least some of them are very specifically Jewish in nature. Sorry about that. So I'm going to essentially skip over from the 50s and 60s all the way to the post-Soviet period because essentially much of the same continues, right? The Soviet Union, until Glasnost, until Gorbachev, the Soviet Union did not permit, for the most part, open discussion of the Holocaust, just as it didn't permit Jews to openly teach Judaism or Zionism. And that, of course, is connected to another complicated topic that we could discuss at another time, which is the emergence or the reemergence of Jewish identity, right, mostly underground in the Soviet Union in the 1960s. The Soviet government's attempt to suppress that, and then ultimately what we know as the Refusnik movement, the part of a larger dissident movement, and so on and so forth. But part of that reemergence of Jewish identity was talking about the Holocaust, was insisting that there was a way to teach about the specifically Jewish tragedy of World War II. And of course, that was a form of resistance against Soviet policy at the time. So to bring it to the present day and to connect with the mission of JFCS to support survivors from the former Soviet Union, I did a little bit of research on this, and it's a very complicated topic for those who know anything about reparations, because there's kind of multiple bills, multiple treaties and legislation that are passed by the German government about reparations. And the upshot here is that most Jews in the former Soviet Union, or those who are emigres from the former Soviet Union, did not get any kind of reparation until much later. And as I've tried to explain to you today, we're really unrecognized in the Soviet Union for what they had gone through, for the specific trauma that they had gone through. And then even afterwards, if they had emigrated, for example, it often took time to identify them and to make sure that they would be receiving reparations. In 1990, the treaty that unified West and East Germany required Germany to establish funds for Holocaust survivors who had received little or no compensation, which of course included the Soviet survivors. And then it wasn't until 1998 that Germany established a fund specifically for Jews for survivors in Central and Eastern Europe. So there's kind of a lag, right? A lag in dealing with these particular survivors. And I know that here in Portland, and of course what's true in this community, I'm sure has been true for other Jewish communities around the country, is that oftentimes our own survivors who hailed from the former Soviet Union were not really understood, right? Their particular Holocaust experience was not really understood and recognized for what it was. And I think this event that you're at today is an attempt to try to change that situation, to rectify that situation, and to make sure that those survivors, who, of course, who are still with us, and also the children of those survivors, because that's important as well, right? That they be recognized for that experience that they went through, even if they were not in any camp at all, right, ever, because some of them were never in a concentration camp. Many of the Soviet Jews were in ghettos, or they were in hiding, or in, let's say, in partisans, and their experiences often did not reflect the kinds of Holocaust experiences that we're most familiar with in the United States. So I'm really, again, I wanted to say what I said at the outset. I'm really grateful to JFCS for creating this program today, and I hope this is the beginning of learning about as I've mentioned, the very specific, the unique experiences and background of Soviet Jews, and in particular, Soviet Holocaust survivors. So thanks for your attention.
Natan, thank you so much. That was terrific, as expected. I don't know if that's fair to say. Back to more good news. There will be Q&A, as I mentioned, and I'd like to bring up in just a moment David Saracen, former columnist for The Oregonian. And when I asked how many years he had done the job, he said, yeah, 30 is fine, which means I'm sure that he did the work for more than 30 years. So he's going to MC Q&A. I'm going to act as Phil Donahue, to use a reference that Natan used at a lecture the other night. And then at the end of Q&A, I'm going to, or she'll just spontaneously appear. Ruth Scott, the executive director of JFCS, will provide closing comments. So, Natan, the mic is yours again, and I think Natalie's going to provide a wireless mic for David. Acoustics are really quite good, but just in case people have a hard time hearing, David will be wired up so that his emceeing can be heard. Would you like to hold it?
Sure. Professor, thank you very much. I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about the persistence of Soviet anti-Semitism. I mean, you took it up to the doctor's plot, but you know, throughout the rest of of Soviet history, there was other evidence of it. You know, the internal passports, which for most people showed nationality, for Jews would label them as Jews, and there was an increasing hostility between the Soviet Union and Israel, which was felt in many ways by Soviet Jews. And I wonder if you could talk about how that attitude and atmosphere affected the treatment of survivors afterwards the war.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to apologize now for turning my back to you, David, because I guess if I'm going to be heard, I should probably speak this way into the mic. But yeah, I obviously skipped over a lot of that because of the timing. But that's a really important element that I'll talk about for a little bit more expansively now. First of all, I just wanted to mention the fifth line in the passport, which was a nationality line. So you said for everyone else it showed their nationality, but for Jews it showed, and I don't know exactly what you meant by that, but I wanted to address that first because it's a kind of a common misperception, because in the Soviet Union, Jewishness was a nationality, right? It was an ethnicity. It wasn't. In the official sense, it wasn't a religion. So for Jews to have their nationality shown on their passport was not unusual, because everyone had their nationality shown on their passport, right? If you were Armenian by nationality, if you're Uzbek by nationality, if you're Polish by nationality, everyone had it on their passport. But it was used to discriminate against Jews, right? So that's the key point. It was used by anti-Semites and by the state in an official capacity to discriminate against Jews. And what expression did that discrimination take? Well, officially, the most widespread form of anti-Semitic discrimination was in education and employment. So I'm talking about the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, to some extent into the 80s, although it was already less by the time Gorbachev comes to power. But Jews generally knew that there was no use in applying to a prestigious state university. You would not get in, right? So they just didn't do it. It also meant that if they were hoping to get placed in a particular job by the state, that they could not hope for a more prestigious job, or even for a job in certain sectors of the economy. So in part it was the state acting against Jews in that particular way, and in part it was the reason we see the educational and professional patterns that we do is because Jews responded to that, right, in certain ways by already kind of placing themselves in certain areas where they would not be discriminated against. You see what I mean? So that's what I meant by you don't apply because you know you're not going to get in. So there's the official discrimination on those levels, and then there's unofficial, grassroots anti-Semitism, which also shows itself in various ways. You find it less in the Soviet Union because it could be prosecuted as hooliganism if there were to be some sort of attack on a Jew or on a Jewish institution. But I would say the discrimination, the anti-Semitism on the official level was actually much more important and much more pervasive, and that, of course, set the tone. You mentioned Israel, and that's another important element, too, because although the Soviet Union was supportive of the establishment of the State of Israel, from very, very early on, it allied itself with Arab states against Israel, and in the 1960s, we see the emergence of a very vicious Soviet anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic, right, propaganda which you can find when I teach my anti-Semitism course. You see the most horrific anti-Semitic cartoons coming out of that particular effort on the part of the Soviet government. So that also tends to, if a Jew is in any way sympathetic towards Israel or the Zionist cause, that immediately places them in the camp of the imperialists, right? Because Zionism is framed as part of global imperialism in Soviet propaganda. So that's another way that the Soviets try to frame Jews as traitors to the larger Soviet cause. That's as much as I'll say right now, but that's at least a little bit of an attempt to flesh out that particular aspect of it.
Thank you. We should open this up to the floor, although I admit I have some other questions I'd like to ask. Ron?
Yes. Under true Soviet rule, the Russian Orthodox Church was really pushed down, but more recently Putin and others have tried to align themselves with the Russian Orthodox Church to resurrect this notion of almost the czarist-like Russian Empire. And the question is this: so with that resurgence of the Russian Orthodox Church, has that given that institutional church in Russia more license to continue to foment anti-Semitism, which it had been going on with a vengeance during the czarist regime?
That's a really good question about the role of the Russian Orthodox Church today. It certainly is today, has proved itself to be the handmaiden of Putin's fascism and of his attack against the West and obviously his aggression against Ukraine. To my knowledge, it has, and I don't know a lot about this, so this may be happening on the grassroots level, but to my knowledge, Putin has not permitted the Russian Orthodox Church to engage in open anti-Semitism. And part of that is because Putin cultivates a very particular image on the home front. And part of that is an image of it'll sound crazy to you right now, but of a multi-ethnic, multi-religious Russia where everyone gets along just fine, and where every religion and ethnic group can have its own particular place. And that explains his cultivation of Chabad in the former Soviet Union, and the fact that Chabad has been able to do so well. It's established a very direct relationship with Putin, and Putin made it clear that he supports official Jewish organizations as long as they support him and his regime. And so I don't think right now it would be in his interest to allow that kind of officially sanctioned anti-Semitism to emerge again. But anything is possible right now, right? Anything is possible in Putin's Russia. So a newly militant Russian Orthodox Church, which is what it is, may well decide that it's going to go. It's going to revive its old ways as far as anti-Semitism is concerned, but so far I haven't heard that that's happening.
Ron, blue shirt.
Thank you. Can you speak to any influence the Soviet Union had over its satellite states post-1945 in how Jewish survivors of the Nazi, occupations of those countries, how they were, dealt with, or how those countries dealt with their Jewish populations?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. So you may be aware that several of the Soviet satellite states, the Warsaw Pact states, had their own anti-Semitic witch hunts, anti-Semitic political campaigns. Poland in the 50s and the 60s. There was a show trial in Czechoslovakia in, I don't remember the exact date, I think it was in the late 50s or early 60s, that resulted in several executions of top Politburo members most of whom had Jewish backgrounds. I think something similar might have happened in Hungary too, although I'm looking to my Hungarian friend in the corner to see if she remembers that. Maybe she'll remind me later. But in any case, so these countries, of course, had their own long anti-Semitic histories, yes? So they probably didn't need all that much prodding or encouragement from the Soviet government, although I think the case of Czechoslovakia is a little bit different because the interwar Czechoslovak state was actually one of the only states in Central and Eastern Europe that did not introduce anti-Semitic policies. So Jews actually had it fairly good in Czechoslovakia in the 20s and the 30s, so there wasn't an immediate history of anti-Semitism to draw upon for that post-war instance. As to your specific question, the answer is I don't know. I'm not sure if the Soviet government actively encouraged those kinds of, I think, my guess is, and I'm kind of searching here back to various works that I've read on this topic, I think there was some official encouragement from the Soviet regime of these various campaigns and show trials, but a lot of them were internally motivated. And because, as we know, there's this long history of anti-Semitism, so they didn't really need Soviets to press on them to do that kind of thing. And the only Soviet satellite state that had a significant Jewish population after the war was Hungary. The other ones, their Jewish communities had essentially been decimated. So, there were small Jewish populations left, and it's significant that many of the Jews who decided to stay in those countries were actually active in the communist movement, and so some of them rose to power, and then you have this backlash as well against Jews, which takes the form of calling out these supposed, imperialist traitors who were in the government. So that's about as good as I can do.
Hi, I had the privilege to be on a scientific exchange program twice with the Soviet Union, once in '69 and '70 under Brezhnev, and then again after the Chernobyl accident with Gorbachev. But the first time I was there for 10 months in the Science City in Siberia,
Akademgorodok, yeah.
And your talk did not discuss what happened in that part of the Soviet Union. It was confined just to the European part, so I wonder if you could describe a little bit about that. But my experience then, and also the second time, was that Russians and Ukrainians work very well, at least at the professional level, and I never saw any kind of discrimination. Really, almost in a depression over what's going on.
Yeah,
nowadays.
well, that's exactly right, because the entire thing has been manufactured by Putin, right? Because Russians and Ukrainians traditionally, I'm not going to parrot the Soviet slogans of the brotherhood of Russians and Ukrainians, right? Because Ukrainians really resent that, and they're their own nation. They're not the little brother of the Russians, but it's certainly true that for centuries now, there have been many Russian speakers in Ukraine, right? Some of them of Ukrainian ethnicity, some of them of Russian ethnicity, and there's been no reason, for the most part, for there to be much friction between them until it's manufactured, as I said, by an outside party that's interested in creating dissent, in creating this kind of conflict. But as far as the first part of your question, the what happened in the interior of the Soviet Union, well, I didn't talk about that area in my talk because I focused on the regions that were occupied by the Nazis. So the interior of the Soviet Union was not occupied by the Nazis. Anyone who was in that area during the war, people suffered because they were dislocated, they were displaced. They often, rations were difficult to get a hold of, but they were able to make it through. There's another piece of the story that I didn't talk about, which might be worth mentioning now, which is that you remember that part of Poland that was occupied by the Soviet Union in 1939, right? So one of the things the Soviet Union did after it occupied that area, after it annexed that part of Poland and also the Baltic states, was it deported hundreds of thousands of suspected bourgeois people, meaning people who owned a store, right, for example, or belonged to a Zionist party. They deported them to the interior of the Soviet Union. Now, at the time, it was a tragedy because these people were sent thousands of miles from their homes. Often, the living conditions were extremely harsh, where they were kind of dumped in Soviet Central Asia, places that are today Kazakhstan, for example. But that deportation, for many of them, it saved their lives, because if they had not been deported, they would have been murdered by the Nazis. So that's an element of the Holocaust. Actually, a colleague of mine just published a book about that particular group of people. As I said, it's hundreds of thousands of people, right? We're not talking about a small group. These are Polish Jews who survived the war in the interior of the Soviet Union, and their story is a story in and of itself that's worth telling, which is in addition to the Soviet Jews who lived in that part, or who survived the war in that part of the Soviet Union, and all of them have their own particular stories to tell. I'm sure they would all immediately hasten to say, if they were speaking with you, many of them are not with us anymore, would say, my situation, my experience was nothing like the experience of people who lived under the Nazis, right? Because they always wanted to create that distinction, because they lived under Soviet rule, and so therefore things were easier for them. But it's a matter of degree, because as I mentioned, their lives were also very, very difficult during the war.
David, if this works for you, I'm going to hand the mic to Judy and then Ed, and back to you for your final question, then we can wrap up Q&A.
Thank you.
Thank you. Natan, thank you. I think you really made it so clear how important it is that these narratives become part of the way we talk about the Holocaust, obviously. So just go back to 1941 for a minute. We already know that the stringent immigration quotas in the United States, other countries between 1933 and 1941, by 1941, nobody was getting out of Central or Eastern Europe. Were any of the Soviet Jews able to get out after the Nazis invaded, or just as the Nazis invaded, or was it impossible?
So other than those who were officially evacuated by the state or by state enterprises, there were people who were able to get out. So, to the United States. Well, no, I'm talking about they had to go east. Yeah, they had to go east. So the chances of those people who were fleeing in 1941 eventually ending up in the United States is pretty low, because they would have ended up somewhere to the east, right, somewhere in unoccupied Soviet territory, and then somehow eked out an existence until the war was over, and then would have come back. With the Polish Jews I was just talking about, it's a different situation, because they were permitted to go back to Poland, and then many of them, of course, as you know, did not stay in Poland. They then went to DP camps, and then they left for other places. So those Jews might have made it to the United States eventually. And so it's a complicated story, because some of those Jews who were in occupied Soviet Poland in 1941 had fled Nazi-occupied Western Poland in 1939. So in theory, someone could have fled eastward, and then come back after the war to a DP camp and then gone elsewhere. But most of those who fled under their own steam, who were officially classified as Soviet Jews, because the Polish Jews refused to accept Soviet citizenship. And so therefore, those Jews were not allowed to leave the Soviet Union.
I'm Ed Newell. In 1978, I went over to London and then went on to do some studies in Eastern Europe and in Russia. Starting then, we've brought 16 fully trained neuroradiologists. The 16 most brilliant people I've ever met. Every one of them published in frontline journals because they couldn't get a job in the United States going back unless they had a PhD. Some of them stayed for 1 to 2 years, some of them up to 17 to 20 years. Many of them stayed in the United States, but they were the most wonderful people. And after training 16, they invited me to be the visiting professor. And what I did is I went through each paper, in not very long, but shown what incredible talent they got. In my story, I think neurosurgeons are a little different.
Sorry, the last word you just said, surgeons?
Neurosurgeons.
Yeah.
And most of them, by the time they finish their residency, are so in debt, they just want to go into private practice, pay their debts, and go on to Kauai. So only one of them was Jewish, and we helped get to go to Israel, and he escaped, but he had to leave everything there. The people there, the neurosurgeons, the neuroradiologists, I basically went there every year because being married to Jill, you have to stop off in Vienna. So I would go over to the Eastern European. But I had very little experience with the anti-Semitism, but the talent of these people is unsurpassed. And thank you.
So you're talking about the talent of the medical professionals that you encountered in the former Soviet Union, and am I getting that right?
I'm talking just about neurosurgery and
neurosurgery,
and
yeah,
neuroradiology.
Right.
And the hospital in Moscow is 17 stories high, and 100% of those beds are neurosurgical problems.
But I think you said only one of the neurosurgeons that you encountered was Jewish. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay. Yeah, that's actually interesting that you say that, because if I'm remembering correctly, I think medicine was one of the fields that, for the most part, you wouldn't find Soviet Jews in, because it was very difficult for them to get into that field. You know, when there have been waves of Jewish immigration from the Soviet Union or the former Soviet Union to this country, I think many of us were a little baffled because it seemed like everyone was an engineer, right? And that was kind of like a not very nice joke that people made. But there was a reason for that, right? Because first of all, in Russian, it's a different, engineer can mean a lot more things than it does in English. So that meant that you were kind of a scientific professional in all kinds of different fields. Because you can also be like it can be a sanitary engineer, for example, if you have expertise on municipal sanitation systems. And so many Jews went into those fields because those were open to them, as opposed to fields like medicine, for example, which were much more difficult to get into. But it's also true, and I'm glad you're saying that, then many people don't realize that the level of medicine in the Soviet Union was, especially in particular areas, was very, very high. We sometimes make jokes about Soviet medicine, but in fact it was certainly advanced in some areas.
There's 4 seniors. One was at least half the year in Israel, half the year in Moscow.
Great, interesting.
So, if we could finish up with something that we're all thinking about at the moment. As your chart showed, there was a considerable Jewish population in the Ukraine before the war, and also some of the worst pogroms were located there. And yet 5 years ago, Ukraine was the only country besides Israel that had Jews as both head of state and head of government. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the status and condition of Jews in the Ukraine at the moment and during the struggle.
Yeah, I'll be happy to do that. I'm sad that we have to, we're in a situation that we have to talk about Ukraine defending itself against Russia, but that's the situation we've been in for almost a year. And it's something that a lot of historians of Jews in Eastern Europe, like myself, have been asked to do recently, is kind of grapple with this seeming paradox of Ukraine being led, Ukraine, which many American Jews think of as a historically anti-Semitic country, being led by a Jewish president. And what I can say a lot of things, but what I'll say is, for now, is that Ukraine has changed a great deal since independence in 1991. And one of the ways it has changed is in embracing its multicultural and multi-ethnic and multi-religious identity. And in many ways, of course, that means, embracing and coming to terms with the past. Now, there's still a lot to be done when it comes to coming to terms with the very, very difficult Holocaust past, because I mentioned today in my talk that there was a lot of collaboration on the local level, which is true. There was also collaboration on the political level. So there were right-wing Ukrainian parties that officially threw in their lot with the Nazis, both because they were anti-Semitic, but also because they were anti-Soviet. And so they thought that they could win some sort of independence for themselves by siding with the Nazis. So that past is still very much there, and it's one I would say that Ukrainian civil society is still grappling with. And recently I heard a Ukrainian academic speak at a conference, and she was kind of confessing her own very deep unease with some of the Ukrainian nationalist figures, historical figures, and symbols that are coming back into parlance today as Ukrainian nationalism has become so much more important, because when there's a war, you need to have, I don't know if this is simplistic, but you need to have nationalism to kind of get people together, right? And there's different kinds of nationalism, as we know. And the nationalism that Zelensky represents, of course, is a very open, civic-minded, multi-ethnic Ukrainian nationalism, which is not about Ukrainian ethnicity, but about a Ukrainian civic identity that includes everyone, right? So that can include Jews, it can include the minority Hungarians in the west of the country. It, in theory, includes ethnic Russians as well. I mean, it's supposed to include everyone. And so that's the Ukraine that Zelensky represents. It's the one that I think most, especially young Ukrainians, see as the future of Ukraine, because that's the Ukraine that's going to enter the EU if it ever does, right? Not a narrowly xenophobic, nationalistic Ukraine that looks back to its World War II past. That Ukraine is not going to get anywhere with the West. So I would say that I don't think it's an equal struggle right now. I think that that Zelensky's vision is the one that is predominant today in Ukraine, and hopefully that will be the one that continues. And by the way, and so this circles back to really what you asked about, is where are Jews in today's Ukraine? And the answer is that they see themselves as part of that Ukrainian nation, which is a big change from 100 years ago, when Jews were an embattled minority in Ukraine. You mentioned the pogroms. There were terrible, terrible pogroms, massacres in Ukraine in the late teens and early 20s that were perpetrated by various Ukrainian militant groups. We mentioned the collaboration during World War II, but I think today's Jews, the Jews who remain in Ukraine, because of course many have emigrated over the past few decades, do actually see themselves as part of this forward-looking Ukraine. And that's a Ukraine that we should all refer to without the. Yes, is everyone aware of that? Because the Ukraine, of course, in Russian and Ukrainian there are no definite articles. So you can't make that differentiation in Russian and Ukrainian. You can't use the or a because they don't exist. there are other ways of doing that. But in English, we should use it without the because the basically suggests that it's a territory of another country, right? And like the South or the North or whatever we would think of, we would use with the. And so if you just say Ukraine, then that signifies Ukraine is independent, it is not a part of Russia, and obviously I think we can all agree in the room that we find this war that's going on right now to be despicable, and the ideology behind it is also despicable, in particular because it draws on, and this is the last thing I'll say, it draws on World War II era tropes to paint the current Ukrainian government, headed by, as you mentioned, right, headed by a Jew, in Nazi terms, right, which is totally outrageous. So Putin kind of spins everything around and backward and upside down, so that the aggressor is the West, right, and so that Ukraine is actually the spearhead of some sort of international effort to undo Russia, and therefore Russia has to fight back and has to defeat these Ukrainian Nazis. And by the way, what Putin often does when he talks about quote-unquote Ukrainian Nazis is he refers to some of those Ukrainian nationalist parties that sided with the Nazis during World War II. So he draws on historical evidence to create this horrific dissimulation, disinformation, whatever we want to call it, that he uses for his own propaganda.
Thank you very much, Professor. It's been fascinating.
So Natan, you said moments ago the last thing I'll say, and I think it was like, oh, really? So I just want to thank you again for this tremendous presentation and learning opportunity. David, thank you so much for helping out with Q&A and being present. And I want to say again, especially Renee Holtzman, if you are watching via live stream, really sorry that you were unable to attend in person today. And there will be light refreshments outside, but first I also want to say a very special thank you to Julie Gibran and to Judy Webb, who prior to this talk got in touch with me saying, will there be a lot of words in Russian, Hebrew, etc.? I don't think I mentioned German. And watching them do this with Einsatzgruppen was very, very impressive. So I would like to introduce very briefly before we say thank you again and goodbye, the Executive Director of JFCS, Ruth Scott, and thank you again for being here.
I'm here to say thank you again and goodbye. First of all, thank you so much for being here and sharing in this lecture. It was such an important step in our education of getting to know much more about the Jewish history, and particularly this long ignored part of the Jewish history. And Natan, thank you for your scholarship, for your very compelling, engaging talk with us today. I leave here with much to think about, and I know you all do too. I do want to do some other thank yous. Thank you, Rabbi Kahana, and for welcoming and your whole team here. It's been wonderful. Thank you so much. And also, thank you to, where's Jen? Where did she go? Jen, Director Knutson, for stepping in and keeping us on track and having this be a fun afternoon, fun in quotes. And David, a lovely conversation, getting the Q&A started off with that depth, and thank you so much for being part of making this afternoon work. And also, I want to particularly thank our co-sponsors. This is a community effort. Congregation Beth Israel, as we've mentioned, the Jewish Federation in Greater Portland, a co-sponsor, and of course our partners, the Oregon Jewish Museum and the Center for the Holocaust Education. important partners in this conversation as we learn more about the history and about our heritage here. Out on the tables out there, those places, we of course have more information about our Holocaust survivor program, about the 60 Holocaust survivors that we support here in the Portland area, 40 of whom are from the Ukraine and former Soviet Union. Lots of information about what goes on there. Also about our other programs, our counseling program and the many things that are coming up over the next few months that will support us as we all cope with what's going on in the world around us. This is something that continues to challenge us, certainly what's going on in Ukraine and Eastern Europe, but what's going on right here in our city and our states. So again, thank you so much for coming. It's a pleasure having you. Please enjoy the food and nosh out there, and of course, a chance to talk with each other. Thanks again for coming.
Ha ha ha!